Hello, friends. I want to start with something that, frankly, should make all of us stop and think. The United States, a country that tells the world it stands for democracy, for peace, for cooperation, has just deployed the world's largest warship to Latin America. Now, if that sounds a little strange to you, that a region with no ongoing war, no military threat to the United States, is now the site of a massive show of naval power, well, you're right to wonder, because there's something deeply revealing going on here. So let's ask a simple question. Why would Washington send the most powerful symbol of its military might to a region historically devastated by U.S. interventions, a region that, over the last few years, has been moving away from U.S. dominance and toward greater regional independence? This isn't just about a ship, it's about power. Economic, political, and ideological power, and how that power is maintained in a changing world. Let's step back for a moment, you see, to really understand what's happening today. The U.S. sending warships, or the constant talk of security and stability in Latin America, we have to remember that none of this began yesterday. This is part of a very long story, one that goes back more than a century and a half. Latin America, in the eyes of U.S. policymakers, was never just a neighbor. It was what they once called, quite openly, our backyard. Think about that phrase for a second. It assumes ownership. It assumes control. It assumes that this vast region, with its own nations, cultures, and aspirations, somehow exists to serve the needs of the United States. Where did that idea come from? It begins with something called the Monroe Doctrine, issued way back in 1823. On paper, it sounded like a warning to European powers, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. But in practice, it meant something very different, that the United States reserved the right to dominate its neighbors. Over the next century, the doctrine became the justification for a long list of interventions. U.S. Marines occupied Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic. American corporations like United Fruit and Standard Oil didn't just do business. They ran countries. Governments that resisted were punished. Leaders who stood up for their people were overthrown. Let me give you an example. Guatemala, 1954. A democratically elected government tried to redistribute idle land owned by United Fruit to poor peasants. United Fruit, of course, didn't like that, and it had friends in Washington. So the CIA staged a coup, replaced the government with a dictatorship, and made sure that land and profit stayed where it was. Or take Child, 1973. Salvador Allende, another democratically elected leader, tried to nationalize copper mines, resources owned by U.S. corporations but located on Chilean soil. He wanted to use that wealth for health care, education, development. Washington called it Marxist danger. What followed was another CIA-backed coup, installing the brutal Pinochet dictatorship. Thousands killed, millions terrified. But the copper stayed in foreign hands. Now, this pattern, it's not a conspiracy theory. It's the historical record. You can read it in declassified documents. You can hear it in the speeches of U.S. presidents and generals. The logic was simply Latin America was too valuable to be left to Latin Americans. But let's look deeper economically. Why was Latin America so valuable? because it offered raw materials, oil, copper, bananas, sugar, all essential for industrial capitalism in the United States. It provided cheap labor, which meant higher profits for American corporations. And it offered markets, places to sell USC made goods when domestic demand couldn't keep up. In other words, Latin America was integrated into the US economy, but always in a subordinate role. It wasn't about partnership. It was about extraction. Now, whenever countries in the region tried to change that relationship, to industrialize, to control their own resources, to demand fairer trade, they faced enormous resistance. Sometimes economic sanctions, embargoes, pressure from the IMF and World Bank, sometimes political interference in elections, funding for opposition parties, and sometimes military coups, invasions, assassinations. What we're looking at here is not a series of isolated incidents, but a systemic pattern, a pattern of imperial economics. The U.S. government, often acting in coordination with corporations and banks, used every tool available to maintain an unequal relationship that funneled wealth northward. And let's be clear, this wasn't done out of hatred or ideology alone. It was done because the structure of capitalism, particularly U.S. capitalism, required it. When profits at home slowed, corporations looked abroad. When workers in the U.S. demanded better wages, companies sought cheaper labor overseas. When resources became scarce, they went where they were abundant and made sure to control them. So when we talk about U.S. interests in Latin America, let's ask whose interests exactly, not the interests of ordinary Americans, workers, farmers, families. They didn't benefit when Chile's democracy was crushed or when Honduras was occupied. The beneficiaries were the corporations, the investors, the same elite class that profited from empire abroad while cutting wages and public services at home. That's the connection too often missed. The same system that exploits workers in Latin America also exploits workers in the United States. Different geography, same logic. So when Washington deploys warships or talks about defending freedom in Latin America, we should remember this is a very old story, a story about power, economic power, political power, and the people who have resisted it generation after generation in the name of real independence. And that, my friends, is not just history. It's the groundwork for understanding the struggles and possibilities of the present. Fast forward to today, Latin America, once treated as a subordinate region, a supplier of cheap resources and obedient governments, is changing again. And this time the changes are profound. Countries like Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, and even smaller nations like Bolivia and Chile are starting to assert a degree of independence that would have been almost unthinkable just a generation ago. They're building their own alliances, negotiating new trade relationships, and perhaps most importantly, looking east toward China. Now, think about what that means. For much of the last century, the United States was the dominant economic force in Latin America. U.S. banks financed infrastructure. U.S. companies mined the copper, drilled the oil, and sold the manufactured goods. The dollar was the currency of regional trade. Washington was, in effect, the economic gatekeeper. But today, that's shifting. China has quietly become the largest trading partner for much of Latin America, surpassing the United States in imports, exports, and even investment. Chinese banks are financing ports in Brazil, railways in Argentina, lithium extraction in Bolivia. Beijing offers loans without the harsh austerity conditions that the IMF and World Bank, those US-dominated institutions, have imposed for decades. So, from the perspective of Washington, what's happening here isn't just trade, it's defection. It's a region once tightly controlled beginning to drift toward an alternative economic orbit. Now, we should ask, why would these nations turn away from the US in the first place? It's not difficult to understand. After decades of so-called free trade policies, privatization, and debt-driven austerity, millions of Latin Americans have experienced the same pattern, promises of growth that delivered little more than inequality and dependency. When the global economy boomed, foreign investors profited. When it crashed, it was the people, workers, farmers, the poor, who paid the price. So when China comes along offering investment, infrastructure, and trade without political lectures, many governments in the region see an opportunity. They're not naive. They know China isn't altruistic, but they also know that diversifying economic power means gaining leverage and, for the first time in a long time, a measure of choice. And that's precisely what makes Washington nervous, because in the logic of global capitalism, economic power and military power are two sides of the same coin. When your corporations, your banks, your currency start losing dominance, your military becomes the last instrument for enforcing influence. And so what happens? The United States sends the USS Gerald R. Ford, the largest and most advanced aircraft carrier ever built, to Latin America. A ship so massive it's been described as a floating city carrying 5,000 personnel, advanced radar systems, and nuclear-capable fighter jets. The official story: joint exercises, regional security, maybe even humanitarian readiness. But let's be honest with ourselves, since when do humanitarian missions require F-35 strike aircraft and Tomahawk missiles? Since when does feeding the hungry or responding to natural disasters depend on the deployment of a multi-billion-dollar war machine? It's not humanitarianism, it's signaling, it's a message, not just to Latin America, but to China, to the rest of the world. Don't forget who's boss. The irony, of course, is that this display of strength is actually a sign of weakness. Empires that feel secure don't need to parade their weapons. They rely on trust, on cooperation, on mutual benefit. When an empire starts sending warships where trade deals used to suffice, that's the sound of insecurity. And here's where a political economy helps us understand the deeper issue. The United States' global dominance after World War II rested on three pillars: military supremacy, economic strength, and ideological leadership, the promise of democracy and prosperity. Today, all three are eroding. The U.S. still has unmatched military capacity, but its economic edge is slipping, and its moral authority, especially after decades of wars, coups, and sanctions, is in tatters. Latin America sees this. The world sees this. And increasingly, they're choosing a different path, one less dependent on Washington's approval. But let's not mistake this for a story about governments alone. Behind these geopolitical shifts are the same class forces that always shape history. Working people in Latin America are demanding better wages, public services, and sovereignty. And working people in the United States, facing stagnant pay and endless wars, are beginning to question why trillions can be spent projecting power abroad while their own communities crumble. So, yes, the U.S. sends a warship. But beneath that display lies a much deeper truth: the world order built on U.S. corporate dominance is cracking, and ordinary people, North and South, are living through its consequences. And the question we must all ask, calmly, seriously, is whether we'll continue to pour our resources into defending a fading empire, or begin imagining a world organized around cooperation, not coercion. Here's what this really means: this deployment, this enormous warship sent to Latin America, isn't about a looming military threat. Nobody in Latin America is preparing to invade the United States. There's no crisis that demands nuclear capable jets off the coast of Brazil or Colombia. No, this is about economic anxiety, the kind that grips an empire when the world it built begins to slip away. You see, the United States global power has never rested on military might alone. Yes, the Pentagon is vast. Yes, the U.S. has bases in over 70 countries. But the real engine of dominance, the one that has kept Washington at the center of world affairs since 1945, is economic. It's about the dollar, the financial system, and a network of global trade designed to benefit U.S. corporations and investors. After World War II, the U.S. emerged as the dominant economic power. The rest of the world lay in ruins. Europe bombed out, Japan devastated, colonies struggling for independence. The United States had the factories, the banks, the capital, and the leverage. And it used them to create a world order where the US dollar became the foundation of global commerce. Oil was priced in dollars. International loans were denominated in dollars. Central banks around the world held US Treasury bonds as their reserves. That arrangement, what economists sometimes call the dollar hegemony, gave Washington enormous power. It could borrow cheaply, print money without the same inflationary pressure other nations faced, and, when necessary, weaponize finance, cutting off countries, freezing assets, and using sanctions to punish those who stepped out of line. But here's the problem: that system only works if the rest of the world keeps playing along. And increasingly, it's not. As Latin American nations trade more with China, use their own currencies for transactions, and reject the old IMF structural adjustment model, they're effectively saying, we want out of this unequal arrangement. They're tired of being told that economic stability requires privatizing everything, cutting social spending, and selling their resources to foreign multinationals. And Washington sees this not as a rational act of self-determination, but as a threat to the system that sustains its global power. So what happens when economic influence begins to weaken? When countries stop taking orders from Wall Street and start setting their own terms? Historically, the answer is chillingly consistent: the military steps in. It's an old pattern, one we've seen time and again. When the tools of persuasion, trade agreements, loans, diplomatic pressure no longer work, the tools of intimidation take their place, Look at history in Iran, 1953. The elected government tried to nationalize its oil. The CIA overthrew it. In Chile, 1973, when Allenby's economic policies threatened U.S. corporate profits, the military, with Washington's blessing, crushed his government. In Central America during the 1980s, economic reforms that empowered the poor were branded communist, and entire regions were plunged into war. Today, the weapons may look different, but the logic is the same. The USS Gerald R. Ford, this gigantic warship sent to Latin American waters, is not about defense. It's about discipline. It's a message to governments, investors, and populations everywhere. Don't forget who's in charge. And notice, this isn't just about Latin America. It's about the entire global South, from Africa to Asia, where nations are beginning to resist Western economic dominance. They're joining new alliances, building alternative payment systems, and questioning the very institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, that have for decades enforced the rules of a USD-centered capitalism. Washington's anxiety, then, is not only about losing influence abroad, it's about what that loss exposes at home. The U.S. economy itself has become dependent on this global hierarchy. The profits of multinational corporations, the strength of the dollar, even the cheap consumer goods that fill American stores, all of it relies on maintaining a system where the U.S. dictates the terms of trade. So when that system starts to unravel, it's not just a foreign policy issue. It's a crisis of the entire economic order. That's why we see warships where there used to be trade envoys. Because for a declining empire, coercion becomes the substitute for consent. And yet, here's the irony: the more the U.S. relies on military displays to sustain its global position, the faster that position erodes. Empires fall not just because others rise, but because their internal contradictions, the growing gap between wealth and poverty, between democracy and corporate power, make their dominance unsustainable. So when we watch that ship sail into Latin American waters, let's not see it as a show of confidence. It's not. It's a symptom of weakness, of a global order struggling to hold itself together as new possibilities, new alliances, and new systems begin to emerge. And that, my friends, is the real story behind the headlines. Let's connect the dots, because what's happening in Latin America this week? The United States, deploying its largest warship to the region, isn't some isolated event. It's part of a much bigger pattern, a global one. At the very same time that Washington sends this aircraft carrier south, it's escalating tensions in the South China Sea, where it's been conducting freedom of navigation operations right off China's coastline. It's expanding NATO deeper into Eastern Europe, bringing new countries into a military alliance originally designed for a Cold War that ended 3 decades ago. And it's maintaining dozens of bases across Africa, often justified as part of the war on terror, though conveniently, those bases happen to sit near regions rich in oil, gold, and critical minerals. When you step back and look at all of this together, the picture becomes unmistakable. This isn't a series of accidents or coincidences. It's one integrated system, a global order designed not around cooperation, but around control. Now, control of what exactly? control of resources, control of markets, control of labor, control of the flow of capital and goods in ways that ensure that the lion's share of profits, the wealth created by billions of working people around the world, ends up in the hands of a very small number of corporations, banks, and investors headquartered in the global north, especially the United States. This is what I mean when I say we live in an imperial economic system. It's not just about soldiers or tanks. It's about who gets to write the rules of the global economy and who has to live under them. But here's what's interesting, that system is showing cracks. For decades after World War II, the United States could maintain this structure with a mix of economic carrots and military sticks. Countries were told, if you cooperate, you get access to loans, aid, and trade. If you don't, you get sanctions, coups, or worse. But that balance, that ability to enforce obedience through both promise and punishment, is weakening. Why? Because new centers of economic power have emerged: China, India, Russia, Brazil, South Africa, and others, forming new alliances like BRICS that explicitly challenge Western financial dominance. They're trading with one another directly, bypassing the dollar. They're creating alternative institutions to the IMF and World Bank. In short, they're writing their own rules, and that terrifies Washington. And it's not only governments that are pushing back. It's also people across the global south, and increasingly in the north as well. Ordinary people are saying, enough. They're tired of being told that security means foreign troops, that stability means austerity, that development means letting multinational corporations strip their resources while locals remain poor. In Latin America, this is especially clear. The region has seen wave after wave of popular movements. Indigenous groups, labor unions, women's organizations, environmentalists, all demanding sovereignty, dignity, and development on their own terms. They're saying, we don't want to be a pawn in someone else's geopolitical game. We want to build economies that serve our people, not foreign shareholders. And that, my friends, is precisely what makes Washington nervous. Because if nations in the global south start asserting genuine independence, not just political independence, but economic independence, it threatens the very foundations of U.S. power. The system depends on access to cheap labor, cheap materials, and compliant governments. If that access is blocked or contested, the profits of the global elite start to dry up. This is why we see the rising militarization of U.S. foreign policy, the warships, the bases, the defense pacts. They're not acts of confidence. They're acts of defensiveness. They reveal a system that's losing its grip, struggling to enforce a kind of dominance that no longer fits the realities of the 21st century. Meanwhile, what ordinary people, from workers in Detroit to farmers in Argentina, actually want is quite simple: a world built on cooperation, not coercion; trade based on mutual benefit, not exploitation; development that lifts people up rather than indebting them for generations. The irony is that these are the same values the United States once claimed to stand for: democracy, self-determination, freedom. But those words ring hollow when they're accompanied by aircraft carriers and economic sanctions. So yes, Washington is nervous, and it should be, because what's rising around the world isn't just a new geopolitical balance. It's a new consciousness, an understanding that the old imperial order, built on inequality and enforced by power, is neither inevitable nor eternal. And that realization, once it takes root, is far more powerful than any warship. Now, let's not forget this isn't about the soldiers on that ship. When we see the USS Gerald R. Ford, that enormous aircraft carrier, bristling with fighter jets and missiles, it's easy to imagine a faceless machine of war, a symbol of empire, but behind that steel and power are human beings, mostly young men and women from working class families, many of them barely in their 20s. They didn't build this system. They didn't design these wars. They're simply trying to make a living in an economy that offers them fewer and fewer options. Let's be honest. The sons and daughters of CEOs, hedge fund managers, and senators are not the ones serving aboard that ship. They're not the ones risking their lives on the front lines of America's foreign adventures. Those jobs fall to the working class, to kids from small towns hollowed out by deindustrialization, from neighborhoods where factories have closed, where unions have been crushed, and where service jobs paying 15 an hour are all that's left. Many of these young people join the military because it promises what the private economy no longer does: stability, healthcare, maybe a college education. For some, it's the only viable escape from poverty. So they enlist not out of a burning desire to project American power, but because they need a paycheck or a path forward, and yet these are the same people the system then uses to protect the interests of those who caused their economic insecurity in the first place. Think about that contradiction. A working class kid from Ohio whose father lost his job when a factory moved to Mexico or China now finds himself stationed on a U.S. warship in Latin America, defending American interests in a region whose cheap labor and raw materials help keep U.S. corporations profitable. He's defending an economic order that impoverished his own community. That is not a coincidence. That's how empire works. It recruits its victims to serve as its protectors. When Washington says these deployments are about defending democracy or maintaining global stability, we should always ask, democracy for whom? Stability for whom? Because for the average worker, whether in Detroit or in Bogota, that stability often means low wages, austerity, and dependency, while the rewards go to multinational corporations, to Wall Street investors, to defense contractors. Look at the economics of this. Every fighter jet on that warship costs tens of millions of dollars. Every missile, every maintenance crew, every overseas base, it all adds up to a Pentagon budget approaching $1 trillion a year. And while that money flows to the Lockheeds, Raytheons, and Northrop Grummans of the world, ordinary Americans are told that universal health care is too expensive, that college can't be free, that rebuilding our infrastructure would burden taxpayers. Doesn't that strike you as odd? We can afford endless wars, but not affordable housing. We can fund 800 military bases abroad, but not schools in Flint or Baltimore. The resources are there. They're just allocated according to the priorities of an economic system designed to serve the few at the expense of the many. And what's especially tragic is that this same system pits working people against each other across borders. The young soldier on that warship has more in common economically, socially, and emotionally with the dock worker in Brazil or the farmer in Honduras than he does with the corporate executive in Washington who ordered the deployment. Yet the system keeps them divided. One wears a uniform, the other struggles to resist foreign influence, and both are told the other is the problem. That's the real genius and cruelty of capitalism on a global scale. It convinces the exploited to defend the mechanisms of their own exploitation. So when we talk about U.S. militarism, we must humanize it, not to justify it, but to understand it. The people inside the machine are not the architects of empire. They are its products, shaped by decades of economic neglect, by a society that abandoned public investment and turned the military into one of the few stable career paths left. And so, while Washington calls this defending democracy, let's name it for what it is, defending an economic system that benefits a narrow class, corporations, investors, political elites, while extracting the labor, loyalty, and lives of the working class, both at home and abroad. Until that truth is confronted, these ships will keep sailing, the profits will keep flowing, and the working class will keep paying in taxes, in futures, and too often in blood. Let's step back one last time. A warship is not just a military tool. It's a symbol. It's a message written in steel and sent across the seas, and symbols, as we know, tell stories. So, what story does this one tell? It tells the story of a superpower struggling to hold onto a world that's slipping away. Not because it's under attack, but because the old order it built is cracking under its own weight. It's the story of an empire that once believed it could control the globe through markets, dollars, and bases, now facing the reality that much of the world no longer accepts those rules. You see, the United States became dominant after World War II, not just through military might, but by shaping a global system, economic, political, and cultural, that kept others dependent. The dollar was at the center. U.S. corporations controlled trade, finance, and media, and Washington dictated the terms, often under the banner of freedom and democracy. But the truth, which more and more people now recognize, is that this freedom was never truly universal. It was freedom for capital, for investment, for profit, for corporate mobility. It was not freedom for workers, nor for nations to choose a different path. And now, that contradiction between the rhetoric of democracy and the reality of domination is coming home to roost. Look at Latin America today. These nations are not declaring war on the United States. They're not threatening its people. They're simply saying, we want to build our economies in ways that serve our people, not your corporations. We want to trade with China, invest in our own industries, maybe even reject the austerity programs of the IMF that have impoverished us for decades. And that, in Washington's eyes, is dangerous. Why? Because if Latin America succeeds in charting its own course, if Brazil, Argentina, or Mexico show that development without U.S. domination is possible, that sets an example. It becomes a model for others Africa, Southeast Asia, even working people in the United States might begin to ask if they can break free of corporate power and build something more democratic. Why can't we? That's the real threat, not missiles, not armies, but the threat of a good example. Empires throughout history have feared this. The British feared it when their colonies in America demanded independence. The U.S. feared it when Cuba nationalized its sugar and oil industries, and it fears it now when nations seek cooperation and self-determination outside its orbit, because power built on domination can't easily coexist with power built on cooperation. One thrives on control, the other on equality, and when the latter begins to grow, the former feels its legitimacy slipping away. Let's be honest about what this means. The world is changing. The economic center of gravity is shifting toward Asia, toward multipolarity, toward systems of trade and diplomacy that don't automatically privilege the United States. For many in Washington, that's frightening. But for most of the world, and indeed for working people everywhere, it could be liberating, because a world no longer organized around one empire's interests might finally be a world where nations can prioritize human needs over corporate profits, where cooperation replaces coercion, and where sovereignty is more than a slogan. Now, will that transition be easy? Of course not. Power never gives up quietly, and the institutions of empire, military, financial, ideological, are deeply entrenched. But history teaches us that when ordinary people at home and abroad begin to see through the myths of power, change becomes possible. So maybe instead of seeing this warship as a sign of strength, we should see it as a sign of fear, the fear of an empire watching its influence fade. And maybe that's not something to mourn, but something to understand, even to welcome. Because as the old hierarchies collapse, the possibility of something new begins to emerge. The question, as always, is what kind of world do we want to build in their place? One based on endless competition and militarized control, or one based on mutual respect, shared prosperity, and democratic participation, not just politically, but economically. If we can begin to imagine the latter, then perhaps the decline of empire isn't the end of something, but the beginning of something better. So, friends, as we watch this enormous warship sail into Latin American waters, let's ask ourselves, what would happen if we redirected even a fraction of that power, that technology, that money, that human energy towards solving the problems that actually threaten humanity? Poverty, climate change, inequality. Imagine if the world's largest warship were replaced by the world's largest hospital ship, or education ship, or renewable energy ship. That would be a show of real strength, the strength to build rather than to dominate. History tells us that empires rise and fall, but what defines us, what defines humanity, is whether we learn from that history or keep repeating it. Let's hope we learn, and let's keep talking about it. Until next time, this is Richard Wolff. Take care of yourselves and each other.